Sure.
First timers here at Revit RVA, welcome. Thank you for coming out. We meet every other month here, mostly architects, and this group is sponsored by CAD Microsystems. And the whole idea is to get together people using Revit and associated tools in the area to talk about how to better use the technology and meet others that are like-minded, that you can converse with and understand what the next steps are and further your career and kind of better your game at what you're doing. So thank you all for coming out. And thank you for those who are coming back to tonight's meeting. This is always about you all and what you're doing, and so these presentations come from your suggestions, and so if you know of anybody that presents or would like to present it at this meeting, please let us know. We have a survey that you'll be getting, and please take the 5 minutes to fill out the survey. That's what drives these meetings. And there'll be a place where you can suggest a presenter or present yourself. We always like to have fresh presentations, and we got a couple good ones tonight. So tonight we'll be hearing from Chris Lindo from CAD Microsystems. He's going to talk about Revit 2020.1 updates, kind of a brief introduction, and then we're going to hear a presentation by Laura Kaiser, who presented here in the very early days of Revit RVA, I think we were talking about 5 years ago, and she works for Clancy and Thies, did I say it right? And this is a presentation that I saw at Built, which is the, I think it's the international conference? An international conference on, it used to be the, what was it, Revit Technology Conference, and now it's the Built Conference. So this is really what I term where all the smart kids go. And it's 3 days worth of very intensive modeling conversations with people from all over the world. And so anyway, I saw Laura present this there, and I thought this was very appropriate for a group, so she came up here from Raleigh to do the presentation for you tonight. And we're talking about BP to PEP. For those who don't know what BIM execution plans and project execution plans are, you're going to learn tonight. But it really is more about how do we share information and how do other disciplines and other organizations work together for the good of the project. And I think that seems to be a reoccurring theme that's going on within people that are, sharing models. So, so anyway, let's start with Chris. Chris, why don't you get us started with your presentation, and thanks for doing it.
Great. All right, thank you guys. So yeah, I'm going to be focusing on Revit 2020.1 updates. Okay, so it's funny that we're focusing on a 0.1 update. Usually we don't really get a whole lot of updates, just kind of bug fixes with point updates. But this one is going to be a really good update. Before I begin, though, who are my MEP guys who works with? Oh, okay, all right, fantastic. All right, well, there's a really cool update for mechanical, and then certainly if you have any other questions, you can feel free to contact me. Okay. So again, we're going to be just kind of showcasing, just kind of discussing Revit 20.1 updates, and then we're just kind of do a brief overview at the end there. So a little bit about me. I am a certified professional Autodesk certified instructor. I'm a speaker at Built North America 2018. I've also been a speaker at XCon. XCon is a Bluebeam conference. So I've been a speaker at 2017, 2018, and 2019. The last one was actually in DC. Anyone go to any one of those conventions? It's not for everyone, but it's a great convention. In fact, if you're a fan of that kind of software, certainly take time to check it out. So I have 5 years plus of experience as a consultant, 5 years of experience in the AC industry. I come from the electrical background. I used to work for a company called MC Dean, based in Sterling, Virginia. Now they're based in Tysons, Virginia, but I came from there as a BIM manager. All right, so general updates. Let's talk about the BIM 360 Sync Activity Indicator. All right, so this is something kind of unique with the BIM 360 online package for cloud computing and cloud sharing of Revit models. This is actually pretty interesting. Whenever you sync your model, right, you might run into somebody synchronizing as well. So you get that little pop-up that says, hey, someone's synchronizing. You're going to have to wait a little bit for that person to finish, and then you'll go ahead and synchronize, right? Well, with that sync indicator, it's going to be actually right there below your canvas area, right next to the work sets. It's going to be a little indicator that says, hey, someone's synchronizing. Go ahead and wait, or no one's synchronizing right now, and go ahead and sync. So they added a little indicator there, which is actually very helpful. But what I've learned is that it just works on the BIM 360 cloud side of things, okay? So keep that in mind, all right? Is anyone using BIM 360 currently or have some projects on it? Okay, so you'll probably see it, but keep in mind that if you do update to 20.1, try to get your team to update to 20.1, okay? It's always a good idea to make sure everyone's updating in unison, okay? All right, so dialogue for connecting walls to roofs. So this is actually kind of funny. When you're connecting, and this is just something for the architects here. So when you're connecting your walls to your roof, you'll actually get this little indicator that says, hey, do you want to connect it to the roof? Well, now there's a little checkbox that says, do not show me this ever again, okay? So they just added that. It's really cool, I guess. Some architects really like it. I think it's just a minor update, but there you go. So you get that cool little dialogue. All right, this other one, actually, I really enjoy this as a model manager. I can expose survey, project base, and survey points for linked models. So this is going to be any sort of survey data from a linked model and any project base point and survey points. This is something that I've really focused on when I'm the MEP BIM manager. It's because I want to make sure that everyone is lined up, right? So when we do that clash detection, I know everyone's in the right place. So this is something very useful for me as a BIM manager, and probably very useful for you as just a regular model manager as well. So keep that in mind. All right, and the next one is row striping. Fantastic. All right, so they added something kind of cool inside schedules now. It's very hard to read some of the schedules inside Revit. Sometimes you have to kind of make things a little bit bigger, zoom in, zoom out, do what you need to. But now there's a little button when you go into a schedule just to say, stripe my rows. And that's the output. Although this doesn't really show it too well, but you'll see that every other row is actually kind of grayscale. Now, I really wish that you could actually change the shading there. I haven't figured out a way to do that yet. But if anyone, yes? Sorry? Not that I know. Well, yes. No, actually, no, it doesn't. I'm sorry. No, it doesn't. I was thinking that this is a sort of printing as a screenshot, definitely, but not putting on the sheet. Yeah. So that's a good question. But as far as just visualizing the schedule, I think it helps a little bit, but that's just to let you know that they're thinking about it when it comes to visualizing. This actually came from an idea from a Revit user, actually, believe it or not. So they incorporated it. They said, why not? All right. So now we're on to the MEP portion. So this is the MEP analytical model updates. Okay, so this is actually specifically for my mechanical guys. All right. So what's kind of cool is, has anyone ever worked with Revit Insight? No? Revit Insight is a way that you can create an analytical model based on what you have as far as a Revit model goes. And then you can change around the design aspects, kind of place in equipment, and model it accordingly. But the problem was you were creating a redundant model. All right? This is something separate from Revit. Now what they did in 20.1 is that they gave you that analytical capability inside Revit. Okay? So it's analytical modeling inside Revit. So there's no redundant analytical model. You can analyze HVAC system design without any sort of modeling, okay? And what I mean by that, any sort of HVAC modeling. So you don't have to put in a VAV. You don't have to put in ductwork. You just specify inside the room what you're looking for as far as equipment goes, okay? Now, again, this kind of removes the redundant analytical model that you might be using right now. It just puts it into Revit. Now, also something to keep in mind here is this is actually done in the architectural model. Does anyone think they know why? Because all your wall materials are in there. Okay, so all your wall materials, your space information, or room occupancy information is all in there as well. And it's also keeping track of any sort of climate changes as far as location goes. So it's taking that information and helping you build that analytical model. So this is actually done in the architectural model, okay? So setup, architectural model, energy settings. You can go right through project settings and go right up to energy settings. Something that I've noticed here as well is that you want to say use building elements, okay? Use building elements. If you use conceptual masses, if there are no conceptual masses in there, well, it's not going to produce a model for you. So you could say use building elements. You could say use both, but I've found that the best output that I've gotten was just actually using the modeling elements. So it's going to get the information from location, and also you'll find everything that you need to produce this analytical model up in the Systems Analysis tab. All right? So system creation. So something to kind of understand here is that before you start producing your analytical model, you have to set up your systems. Okay, so you have to really just define what kind of systems you're going to be creating. So you can create an air system, a water loop system, zone equipment, and all this is done in the system browser. Okay, so when you open up the system browser, there's that little drop down. Just drop it down to analytical systems, and then you got those three tabs right there. So you can start creating your analytical settings right there. Okay. Come on. There we go. System tying. So this is a little gift just to show you that when you have your systems together, you can actually specify with your system equipment what other kind of equipment is it using. So I created a water loop. Well, now I can actually have my VAV unit use that water loop. Okay. Or I can say this particular zone equipment is using this VAV and this water system that I'm defining separately but bringing it together as a group. Okay? So you can tie these systems together inside the analytical model. So when you have that done, then you can go ahead and start creating your system inside the model. So in this GIF, what I have is creating this system kind of layout. Really, you're just kind of drawing out a pathway of where your system is going to be taking place inside these offices, and I have it crossing through the workspace as well. And then there, I'm defining the zone equipment, okay, the VAV, and since it's all tied in my Systems tab, that VAV, any systems that are connected to that VAV is part of that system as well. Okay, so anything that I tie to that VAV over there in my Systems tab gets tied to it as well. So you can create that analytical run, and you can create as many as you want inside that model. Okay. So then once you have it, you can now create a 3D view and be able to analyze this in sort of a systems analysis view here. What you're seeing here in the 3D view. Okay. All right. And then finally, you can create, whoops, actually, let's go back here. You can start to create an analysis report. So what you actually can get is an analytical space report. So it's just a report that gets generated up over here in the project browser. It'll give you space information. Now, for right now, I haven't figured out a way to get it just to report what I have in the model. So say if I just do the first floor, just do the first floor. It's actually just doing the whole model, but still, it's actually a report that gets generated, and then you can continue to generate that report as you continue to build your system. So this is something to keep in mind, especially when you're going through your DDs, right? You can start to do this at the 30%, start thinking about it throughout the 60%, and then finally finalizing everything between 60, 90, or however you want to work, okay? So just as a summary, there are some small little updates with Revit. Certainly, I think that one of the better ones is actually the striping of the schedules. And then, of course, being able to see my survey points and my project base point through links. I think that's just actually really, really fun to use. All right, and it gives me a lot of really great information. And then, of course, the MEP update. Now, that MEP update is probably one of the bigger ones that I've seen since probably 2015, 2014-ish. Okay, are there any questions? Yes. That's a good question. So the question is, can the analytical model be used or within the architectural link, or with the link with the architectural linked into the MEP, right? With the architectural linked into the MEP, right? From the MEP, right. Unfortunately, not. So it needs to actually be in that architectural model. But keep in mind that you should hopefully have the architectural model. If not, if it's a BIM 360 model, maybe you can try to get that as a downloadable project file, separate file. Yes.
What was the reason that Autodesk did it that way?
Yeah, right. I can't presume what the reasoning was. What my guess is because since the architectural link that comes into the MEP model, really all we're seeing are just surfaces. We're not actually seeing the materials or that space information, such as occupancy information, and things related to the material of the room and windows and things like that. That's all in the architectural model. Since I'm just having a link, it's just a reference. So I think that's the real reason. I need to actually have those objects inside my model, not just a reference. That's my 2 cents. I'm not too sure exactly if that's their reasoning, but that's my guess from my experience. Good question. Yes?
So that implies that they can't use just the generic wall, they actually have to build a wall with brick and chip and insulation and that kind of thing?
Oh, yeah. The comment is, so they actually have to build out those walls to be the actual, instead of just generic walls, to actually have the materials in there. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
So what I'm understanding is this analytical model being 100% dependent upon the architect, really it's only as good as the architect's model is.
Mm-hmm.
So the model isn't always great, it's not working.
So the comment is yes, if I'm understanding it correctly, the architectural model needs to be up to snuff, essentially, right? Yes, the architectural model needs to have a certain level of completeness, right? But also keep in mind that a lot of times these projects are going to be requiring a certain level of detail, right? An LOD, right? So I'm already expecting that. If it's a LOD 400 project, or even a 350, I'm still expecting my materials to be there. So yes, the analytical model is only as good as that architectural Revit model. It's a great comment. Yes. And other question?
So, it seems to me the big problem here, correct me if I'm wrong, is that unless you can define the analytical model within the architectural model that architects are using, then the next time you get an update, if you bring it down, say 30%, 60%, you have to recreate the analytical model. Is that true?
Yes, yes, you do. Yes, you do. The only thing is, you can, I believe that you can transfer project standards, so you can get that analytical systems at least to show up, but the actual run of it, yeah, you're going to have to draw it again. Yeah. But again, keep in mind also that a lot of times you're doing this in terms of concept as well. So there's a conceptual design there. So of course it's going to change. Of course you're going to have to relay out things. But at the same time, I don't want to have to do the whole thing over again. So that's a great comment. Yes. All right. Any other questions? All right. Great. Well, thank you very much. Hopefully this was somewhat informative. I am actually a little bit excited just because they're actually starting to put more MEP content in there. Might not be exactly what we want, but hey, it's getting there. All right, great. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Laura. Thank you, Chris, for doing that. And I think this is a good segue. Why don't you come on up here, Laura, into Laura's presentation, because yeah, as you brought up with these questions, yeah, if you don't have tight modeling standards, or people aren't modeling in the iterations that you need to model, then this doesn't provide you with much value because you're not going to be able to do the analysis you want to do. So Laura's going to be talking about BIM execution plans, project execution plans, and perhaps that could be a solution to this problem so we can use the least amount of time in getting these projects out. But let's have a big hand for Laura for coming up here from Raleigh to speak to you tonight.
Well, thank you all for having me here. As Jeff said, my name is Laura Kaiser. I work with Clancy & Thays Construction Company in Raleigh. This presentation I actually gave it built this year. I did have a co-speaker there on the bottom, Volker Husel. He's up in Albany, so he could not be here tonight. But he does have some information in here, so that I wanted to make sure I credited him. So Clancy & Thays, we are headquartered in Raleigh, been around for 70 years with 5 offices across the Southeast. One here in Virginia, over in Newport News. I don't know what direction I'm actually pointing, but Orlando, Charlotte, and Wilmington as well. I've been with the company for about a year. I'm actually an architect, so I worked in architecture for about 13 years. I was really heavily involved in more of the BIM and Revit side. I spent about 3 years of my career. I was up in Baltimore, with a firm of about 100, just doing Revit support, standards, training. So I was really involved in that aspect, which kind of led me into my current role as a VDC coordinator for a construction company. So today what we're going to talk about is we're just kind of look and first start with some scenarios to see how we're going to frame this session. We're going to talk about what needs a BIM execution plan should fulfill, what needs it should not fulfill, how you can tie that into an overall project plan, and then what changes do we think can be made throughout this process. So before we start, who here uses a BIM execution plan? Okay. Has anyone started one or worked with one with other companies? Okay. That's fine. That's why you're all here, right? To learn about how it can help you. So this will be helpful, this first start, about thinking about these scenarios and different standards that we're using in this process. So this is a really common scenario for a BIM execution plan, because how many designers are here in the room? Architects, engineers, most? Any contractors? Okay. So you've got a design lead, usually the architect, leading consultants with a BIM execution plan. So this is the one I'm most familiar with, the one I've used the most in my prior life. So really just trying to make sure everyone knows how to work together. It's usually pretty simple, just really stating, you know, one example, who's going to model the lights? That always comes up, right? Architect, electrical at some point is going to shift. Are we going to have two? So really addressing those things in this format. Downside is there's no contractor or owner input in this scenario, purely for design. Moving on, a really similar situation where a GC or CM is going to develop that BIM execution plan to work with their subcontractors. So this is where I'm working day to day now. So we've got a BIM execution plan we use before we start coordination with all of our subcontractors. We might have third-party modelers. I'm encountering that a lot now, where a subcontractor does not have modeling staff on board, so they're bringing a third party in to actually do the modeling for them. But they really need to be involved in this process because their model really matters. Even though they aren't the actual company installing it or the ones who designed it, it really is going to affect our coordination. But similar to the first scenario we kind of showed, this doesn't have any owner input either. So this is more applicable to like a design build or CM scenario where you've got a construction manager and then your design lead, trade partners, anyone else that might be involved. I worked in a scenario like this several years ago on a large project for the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, where at the time, we didn't have as an architect, we didn't have a really very savvy BIM execution plan. The contractor holder did, so they kind of led the whole process. We sat through a meeting with everyone there, you know, CM, architect, engineers, some subs, the owner, to really talk about how this whole process would work. And then finally, a scenario I've never been involved in is with an owner-required BIM execution plan. I see this a lot with, has anyone worked with an owner-required, I'm guessing not. I never have. I see this a lot with some of the bigger institutions, universities, hospital systems, really large organizations that A, have the manpower to even put one of these things together and then to enforce it. Obviously, this is a great scenario to get everyone involved, everyone at the table. So having the input from everyone can really help as we're putting together these plans. A lot of standards out there. How many of you have seen this Penn State project execution planning guide that's been kicking around for a while and referenced everywhere? It has some good information in it, but I also think it can be really overwhelming. There's a lot of stuff in there that, depending on the level of project you're working on, may or may not apply. One thing I do think is useful in here when you're trying to break down, let's say you are trying to write a BIM execution plan and think about how you actually want to use the model, is the terms that they have in this document are pretty widely used. So if you're working with other entities, using the same terminology can really help people understand what's going on. Same thing here, you get into more worksheets. This is where I think it starts to get a little overwhelming for smaller projects. We have other industry standards. Talk about overwhelming. Who has ever looked at the LOD specification? Okay. It's complicated. I think part of it on smaller projects can just be handled by discussions without going through the crazy spreadsheet. It is, however, similar to what I said about the Penn State thing, it gives definition. And whenever you're working with a group of people, it's always good to have a baseline definition so you're not wasting the time trying to come up with one on your own, and B, you all know what you're talking about. Graphics, I think, help too in certain scenarios, but on my projects, I'm not going through every single element. We're, in most cases on smaller projects, making blanket statements of, LOD 350. And if there is a need for more, we will address that. But for the most part, we're not getting into a 400. And this is talking from a construction side. Other industry standards out there, the AIA contractual documents we have available. Anyone using these? Okay. Also, consensus docs, more on the construction side. I've been introduced to this. So same thing, they do have some really good information on how they're using, on what you can include in a BIM execution plan. Thinking more beyond just, I use it a lot just for coordination, but thinking about scheduling, estimating, other data that we can all collect from this model. Okay, so that's kind of the framework of where we're going with this, what I had in mind as we put together this session. So we're going to think about what needs should a BIM execution plan fulfill. To really get into the technical details of the BIM tools you're using on a process. That was the definition that we came up with. So one of the big things, obviously, is identifying those technical aspects. So in a lot of software we have today, thinking about licensing and access needs, we want to make sure we're addressing that in that plan, right? So everyone knows how we're working together, what software we're using. Thinking about software update timing, like Chris said, you want to make sure everyone's always on the same version, same update, but thinking about how that's going to affect your project as it moves through. Because, I've worked on projects before that have been stuck in an old version of Revit because people were too afraid to move forward. And then 4 years later, you're like, why am I still using these really old tools when I have much better ones available? There's only been once or twice where I actually did have some technical issues with upgrading, but for the most part, not. So here's an example. Who in here is using BIM 360 docs? Anyone? Okay. So when you're thinking about access control, it's a great feature in terms of being able to control who has access to what, but it's still that extra step of making sure that everyone has the right permission to what they need. But just making sure you define this in your plan. Are you using this? We go through and we list, this is where we will store this, this, and this, so that everyone knows what they have access to, what they need to request access to, and what we're planning. Thinking about how we're just sharing everything. Model sharing is another big topic. I was talking earlier with a few folks. So thinking about what tools you're using throughout the project. There's going to be different ones, right? You might be starting with SketchUp. You might be then using Revit, and then maybe using Revisto, all sorts of Navisworks, bringing in AutoCAD, bringing in all sorts of stuff. So really defining how all that sharing is going to work is really important. The BIM execution plan should address that. And then setting a clear process and structure so that everyone knows how things are going to move along. Projects are really complicated, right? And they're continuing to get more complicated in less amount of time. So if you have a good structure, it goes back to what I said before, it takes you less, you're not reinventing the wheel every time, and you can also really help people move through it. Just thinking about all these different softwares that are coming in can be complicated. Modeling overlaps, a big one. Like I mentioned before, lights. Who models lights? Who models plumbing? How do these connections work? So a BIM execution plan can address those. Maybe someone starts it, someone then moves on with it. Also, naming conventions. When you're linking models, I've had models before that are just the file name from, let's say, structural engineer, and it's their project number underscore some, a project reference that's an old project name that no longer applies. It can get really confusing when I look in my links. I'm like, well, what? Or I'm selecting a link in my model. Like, is this MEP? Is this structure? So really establishing those can help people work through. And then as you're updating links, you're being sure that everyone is using the same names. So here's an example from Volker looking at how different model elements are being carried through the project and who's responsible at what time. So really addressing that. In this case, I use the plumbing example. So during conceptual design, almost everything is being done by the architect, but then as you move forward through schematics and then off the page into construction documents, design development, it's going to change. Here's an example from our current BIM execution plan, thinking about naming conventions. So really getting down so that everyone uses the same, and then it just really makes it easier, like I said, as we're updating, and also just to understand what you're actually looking at. Or if you're looking at a browser in Navisworks, knowing which model is which really easily. So that's what a BIM execution plan should address. Too often, and really the genesis of this session was, so at Built 2018, I did a panel discussion on coordination between disciplines. And we had one small portion where we were talking about BIM execution plans, and there was one attendee who had lots of questions, and we kind of had to, he would not stop talking about BIM execution plans. Because he realized, as I knew, that they're so hard to use. How often, if you have used a BIM execution plan, have you filled it out in a meeting and stuck it in a drawer and no one ever looked at it again? And I think part of that is because we include information in there that shouldn't be in there. So that's really how this whole idea of this presentation started, was we knew that BIM execution plans aren't really what they should be. So what should it not fulfill? And it's really anything related to the overall project management. 2 times there's many overlaps, and then the document gets outdated when it really shouldn't, and no one ever references it again. That's what we want to avoid. So looking at different project roles, contact information. How many times have you updated contact information for someone, and then you have to do it in like 5 different places, and it never really gets to the right spot? So really being smart about where you're putting all that information before it gets outdated. Also making sure that as a project whole, you're getting the right people involved in this BIM execution plan. As far as putting together a plan during the construction coordination process, I want to make sure that I have people that have field knowledge in these coordination meetings as part of this process, because they really need to make some judgment calls on what can and cannot be done. So making sure that you're identifying, kind of looking whole project as to who should be involved in the process. If there are ways where you can integrate with existing databases, whether you're using 360 Docs, New Forma, anything out there, just trying to kind of consolidate where you're holding all this information, and really understanding the relationships between all the different parties involved. I said we use a lot of third-party modelers. We give them to we might assist subcontractors in finding them. So just understanding how that contractual relationship is going to work will really help as we move through. So here's an example just of a contact sheet. And like I said, we're making sure that during coordination we have a modeler, we have a decision maker, and someone with field knowledge involved at every step, so that we try to, I should say, to make sure that we're getting really accurate coordination models that can be built in the field. Another overlap that gets put into BIM execution plans that really shouldn't fit there is thinking a lot about deliverables. So we want to make sure that we're really looking at the modeling scope with our project scope, making sure we're hitting all those targets. And thinking about how the model will be used at the end. Do we have owner requirements? We're working with a school system that they have in our contract, not the designer's contract with the owner, but the contractor's contract with the owner. We have a requirement to provide an as-built model, and that's all it says. So, just trying to get out of them, what do they envision using with this model? What model do they want? We end up giving them all the native design files in an NWD file. What do they do with it? Do they do anything with it? What do they want to do with it? What do they think they can do with it? So really kind of starting those discussions is more of a broader project, doesn't really hit those really technical aspects we talked about at first. So you're really trying to identify how someone is going to use the model. If you're a designer thinking about how a contractor might use the model, that's another way too. Here's some examples of putting together really detailed information and thinking about how modeling can tie into this architectural example here. So looking at what type of information you're providing and how can that tie back into the modeling. Here was another spreadsheet. So my co-presenter Volker said this got a little complicated. They provided it so that a project manager could ideally come through here and check boxes as to what they thought they wanted to do on a project. But it got too complicated and everyone said, well, we already kind of know what we're doing, so we're just going to ignore that. So really trying to address things like this that shouldn't be in that BIM execution plan. It's a broader project goal. So before I kind of move into how we can tie, aspects of the BIM plan into a project plan, does anyone have, since there were a lot of BIM execution plan newbies out here, anyone have any questions about just BIM execution plans in general?
Do you find it something that you have to come back and revisit throughout the project, or is the goal to have one discussion, one plan, and then there's very few edits and revisions as the
Mm-hmm.
project?
So the question is it something that's done once, or are you revisiting it, right? I think ideally, and I'll actually hit on that later, is that I think it should be revisited. What happens too often is it's filled out once, and then everyone says, okay, now we kind of know what we're doing, but then it's never enforced, and no one ever really goes back to it. Trying to think about ways where you have to force people to go back to it, whether it's even as simple as including in meeting agendas that we're looking at this part of it, or have something that you have to fill out at a certain time. That way people reference it, because that BIM execution plan, we gave the definition of it's, identifying the technical aspects. It's really also trying to identify like a level of expectation so everyone knows what they're responsible for. So that if you're working on a design team, like I think most of you in here are, you understand what to expect from your consultant, or working as a consultant, you know what your architect is expecting from you. So really setting that level of expectation. So being able to go back to that, I think, helps people understand this process better. Other questions? No? But I think a BIM execution plan is really helpful, just like I said, to set that level of expectation, making sure everyone knows what you have in mind. So after looking at what a BIM execution plan should fulfill, what it should not fulfill, now we're going to go ahead and take a look at what aspects can be tied into an overall project plan. So looking at the project requirements, thinking about specific tools that can address the project needs. Like I said, all sorts of different tools will be used throughout the life cycle of the process, and how can we really identify those? Also thinking about team members' experience. Different markets is obviously going to vary. I started up in Baltimore, moved down to Raleigh. There's even in that short distance change in market affected who was doing modeling, who was up to snuff on all this stuff. So really understanding that, when I was talking about third-party modelers, that's another thing where we want to make sure we know their experience before we bring them on, because it can really impact the whole process. This also kind of ties into your question about whether it's something you fill in once or come back to, is making it flexible. So making it flexible enough that we have a reason to address it, but also addressing different project types. In one office, you might be working on giant projects and small projects. How do you make this plan flexible enough that it can be used by everyone, but standard enough that everyone knows how to use it? Also talking with industry peers, coming out to things like this, really talking with people, understanding how people are using BIM execution plans out there will really help as you try and develop one for yourself. So here's an example from our BIM execution plan. We use that Penn State potential BIM uses, but what we want to do is try and get a little more project specific. So really think about what uses we are going to use, and then how that's really going to affect our project. So in this case, we're just doing some basic digital fabrication with some layout, and then 3D coordination. So we were able to really quickly identify those. Here's a bad example. This is an old BIM execution plan that I'd done where we had this section for model analysis that everyone just said, I don't know if we're doing any analysis, so no one ever filled out this page. It might as well not have even been in there. It was just way too vague. It didn't address like specific project needs. So here's another example from our current one where I kind of took that a step further, and this also just requires part of the whole, you can put together a great BIM execution plan, but if you don't actually talk to people and communicate well, it doesn't really go anywhere. So in this case, we sat down at the beginning of the project with our subcontractors and said, okay, what additional coordination notes do you want us to include in here? So we came up with edge of slab, elevator support, our framed openings, and hangar locations, and we actually identified who was responsible. I don't want to say we followed through 100%, but the intent was there. So that's where another thing I'm looking forward to. And the next part of this is also, I don't have all the answers, just thinking about what we can do better. And just finding a way to kind of follow up on this as we move through. Some of these items we hit, some we didn't. So, I said the maintenance of the document. I'm still trying to think about ways that we can add kind of milestones in there that require you to go back to it so that people actually use it, and really incorporating into your overall workflow. So it's not just one meeting and then everyone forgets. I think also when I mentioned before about including the whole project team, that helps too. Really thinking about how different people can use this document and not just the BIM manager and the modelers. So here's an example of a checklist that we have in our office that unfortunately is the last page in a document that no one reads. Really, I think it should be the first page so people see it. And it's actually pretty good, talking about what different items should be addressed by what person at what stage in the process. So this is thinking kind of bigger picture, all the way from pre-construction down through the end. So thinking about all the different spots, we can help our estimating team when they're doing cost estimating. Obviously, we're helping out project managers with coordination, but then beyond that, we're doing, drone overlays for field verification. We're dabbling a little bit in laser scanning for verification. So how do all those different items that are BIM related but still fit into the broader project plan, how do we incorporate that? We want to make sure that everything is really easy to understand. No one is going to read a really lengthy, written like a book kind of document, so making it quick and easy. Like when I write emails now, if I can, I try and make it bulleted because I know the people that are reading it, their attention span is just enough to see what's there. And also, Volker had made this term, matrix overload. We want to avoid matrix overload. I talked about that LOD specification spreadsheet. It's crazy. That is matrix overload. Combine that with all the other spreadsheets that you've got, and it gets kind of crazy. So here's another bad example of an old BIM execution plan where we had this really lengthy point number 7 talking about the coordination meeting. Really all you need to know in there is that it's going to be held weekly, and that's it. All the other stuff, and the most important piece of information is also stuck in the middle of a sentence. So when we revamped it, we went ahead and made it really simple. Bulleted points, meetings are going to be here at this time. We don't specify dates, getting back to not having overlap of information, having that somewhere else, and then just really basics, done. Much easier to understand. So here's an example of the LOD spreadsheet. Going through all these, I'm not going to say this does not apply to some projects, but for most projects that I work on, this is way too much. So how can we better address all these needs that we talk about? So after I go through this presentation, I'm actually going to pull up an old BIM execution plan that I went through and really identify what didn't work in it. And that's what you're seeing an example of here. So I included this because I knew there'd be a lot of designers here. So thinking about how we can make it more relevant to project management, working as an architect, so that you're getting everyone on board. Also expanding users' understanding of BIM, that it's not just Revit, right? It's all this other stuff that goes into it. It's the process of how we're sharing information. There's a lot that's included. Incorporating programming, so really getting started early on in a project and really thinking about how you can use it throughout. And then all the way down to facility management. You know, I talk a lot about that I think there's still a software piece missing to get from the end to the owner, but just thinking about the potential, how might your model be used someday, even if it's not going to be today. And then my goals I'm looking at in this BIM execution plan, same thing. How do I address needs of my project managers? Because it's their they're the ones running the project. How do I make sure I get them on board? Because it's going to work so much better if we've got everyone involved. And then same thing, looking at pre-construction, but also looking at collaboration with designers. So I'm actually working with Mosley on a middle school project up in Raleigh. And we had a meeting early on just about how we intended to use the model. We've been given model updates. So really kind of think about how we can also get more collaborative at that end to really kind of set that level of expectation, but also build a really good relationship as we move through the project that we're going to be working on for several years. I've mentioned that I want to try and integrate it into regular meetings, and then also thinking about how we're using BIM 360. So in our BIM 360 docs, we're posting our federated models after each coordination meeting. So we actually have project managers that are going in and looking at the model and walking through on their own and identifying issues. So thinking about how that can move forward, because that opens up a whole other world. And this morning I was actually showing one of our project managers that feature, and he said, I'm going to use this. Like, now I know where to find it. I can come back in here. He said he was a little rusty, but he got it. And so now we have those models available. So thinking about how even that aspect can be tied as we're putting all these plans together. So the basics, before I flip to this example, we want to make sure we're keeping all the technical items together in a BIM plan, but then pulling out a lot of those items that I just discussed into a more comprehensive plan. And then I think the most important thing, and I say this in every presentation I give, is communication, both internally and externally. We can talk all day long about all these great standards and ways of doing things, but really it's just talking to the different people that you're working with. So while I pull up this example, does anyone have any questions? Anyone starting to put together a BIM execution plan? Are you now inspired to put together a BIM execution plan? Have you kept track of how many times I've said BIM execution plan? Sure. So the question is there a threshold for size for when we put together a BIM execution plan? If we are doing coordination on a project, we are putting together a plan. But that means that the project's big enough to do coordination on. So I guess there is some level of threshold. When I was working as a designer, I did it no matter what. If I was sharing Revit models, we had a plan. Even if it was, I worked on a 9,000 square foot pre-engineered metal building for a community college, but we still had some people modeling, so we did a BIM execution plan. And it also, I think, helps if you keep things consistent so that people understand how to use it. If you say every project we are using this plan, people in your office understand how to use it, and then if you're working with the same consultant groups over and over, they understand how to use it and also what's going to be expected of them. So I think keeping it consistent really helps. Question?
Yeah, a few minutes ago you mentioned the models that you call federated models.
Mm-hmm.
What is a federated model?
So what I mean by a federated model is when I'm working in coordination from a contractor perspective, in Navisworks, I have loaded in all my subcontractor models, and then I post that so the federated model contains the designer models, any supplemental modeling that I've done as a GC, and then all my trade partner models. So it's everything all in one. So if you think of like a Revit model with everything linked in, this is just like the Navisworks version. So it's just combining everything. And I may not include designer MEP models because the subcontractors are modeling that same information. So I probably will leave that out. I might keep it in if I'm trying to look at one specific thing, but generally it's architecture, structural. It might be, it might be the structural engineer's model, or we might have concrete and steel models from our subcontractors. So it really depends. But does that answer your question? Yeah. Federated model? Any other questions? Okay. So this is an example of an old BIM execution plan that I had. And I just really went through, obviously part of it was for the presentation, but I actually did it by hand when I was trying to rewrite a new BIM execution plan. So I'm just going to go through here and talk about some things that worked and some things that didn't. So the first was thinking about, what all are we including this? Is it all appropriate? Let's see if I can. So the first thing, big red X. We had this section of project basics, talk about overlapping information. We were trying to put in, it made sense at the time to identify like milestone dates, but have you ever worked on a project where the milestone dates that you wrote down at conceptual design or schematic design actually followed through? Because I never have. So it just became completely invalid. So I said, this is not necessary. We are addressing this in so many other documents on the project. We don't need this in our BIM execution plan. So next, thinking about the modeling plan. Really trying to, same thing, pull out information, not just BIM, getting more broad project. Inserting something which I showed you the example of project goals. So looking at that Penn State guide to really use industry standard terminology. Thinking about model sharing. So are you going to be using Newforma? Are you going to be using BIM 360 docs? How are you going to sharing it? Really identify how are you going to share it and when you're going to share it. And then think about the model types that you're needing. So when I'm doing coordination, your question about the federated model, my subcontractors were running coordination in Navisworks with NWC files. We're really using Glue to do it, but NWC files. So they are posting NWC files. But sometimes people want to do their own coordination within Revit using native files. So we actually spell out that they are uploading NWC files to Glue and then RVT files to docs so that people have access to both. It's hard to keep up with. We are looking for a solution where people really only have to upload once instead of trying to keep two models updated at the same time. When I'm doing, because on most coordination projects, I am doing some supplemental modeling, whether it's, the example I'm doing now, it's a shell and core building, office building, but I wanted to put in like a generic placeholder ceiling for tenant spaces. So we knew that we weren't poking through that as we built our trade models. But really thinking about what file types you're using and when you're going to use them. Already talked about software updates. The question should always come up, working as a designer, does it need to be in the contract language? I think that's still a question for the industry to figure out. We do include on some projects, contract language, referring back to the consensus doc information about what subcontractors are actually required to build into their models. Whether or not it gets enforced depends on the project. Same thing, really kind of trying to streamline this. We didn't need this whole section on software systems. We are already addressing that on the previous page. I think one of the big things, and Chris touched on this too, is model reference coordination. In Revit, as an architect, I said, well, I'm just going to start. And then once I get engineers on board, I just told them to link in origin to origin, and we were done. Well, now that I'm trying to bring in an architect's model, and I've got a fire protection subcontractor working in an AutoCAD kind of add-on who he can't really set his origin. I mean, it gets really complicated to make sure that you've got everything in the right spot once you move beyond one file format. So, and I've also heard that Autodesk may be kind of changing the shared coordinate, how that whole really confusing system works. I consider myself, pretty Revit savvy. Shared coordinates, I have sat through many a session and it still baffles me. I have never mastered it. So really trying to identify how we're bringing all these models together is really important. We talked about precision, but this came back to, if we're referencing that LOD specification, do we really need to have something in here about precision? Because it's also referenced in that specification. We also had in really bold letters that the model should be considered accurate and complete unless you noted it, and that they should accurately reflect the two-dimensional drawings. Same thing, that is kind of already referenced in the LOD spec. And the reason for that was left over from an experience I had, I don't know, maybe like 10 years ago, where a structural engineer modeled all the trusses 2 inches lower so his plans would look right. But when you looked at it in section, it obviously was not in the right spot. So I got really scared and put that line in there, and it kind of stuck around. Now I don't think it's as much of an issue, but I was talking with Jeff earlier, now working in coordination, I need to make sure that I'm verifying everything against 2D drawings, right? Because that is what is going to be built, is the 2D drawings. So I find that I am taking the structural engineer's, foundation model and actually checking foundation heights or foundation elevations against the drawings. So there is still that checking. Generally it's correct, but I still have to ensure that everything matches. And that got back to what I just said. Also, I think a lot of what's in here can be useful for just a guide for a discussion. Remember, this is a bad example we're looking at. I didn't bring the good example with me. But just making sure you've got the right people at the table. I've sat in meetings where I'm going through this BIM execution plan, and let's say not picking on mechanical engineers, I just picked that one. They don't have anyone in the room that's actually doing any modeling. Well, that's really going to affect when you can talk about what you can and cannot do. So just making sure you've got the right people at the table. Same thing, we want to make sure that if we do have any other references, that we include these in here so that we know where to refer back to. In this case, subcontractors in an annex to their contract do have what items they should be modeling. I just said make chart more user-friendly, matrix overload, really identifying what people are going to be modeling. I still need to sit down with some of my more savvy subcontractors and identify what are you modeling specifically, what are you not modeling, what things do we have in here that are ridiculous that you would never model, so that we can really start to identify those. Same thing with consultants. As an architect, reaching out to my consultants and saying, what are you realistically modeling? Let's make sure, I don't want to ask you for something that you can't provide, because we all want to work together, right? Another point here is adding, I talked in the presentation about adding flexibility. One case would be multiple architects. I've worked on a couple projects with multiple architects, and really thinking about how we then incorporate those two models. One example, a project I was working on, we had a lab planner working with us, they were doing some interior spaces, but then we would do the corridor. So trying to figure out how those models actually interface with rooms and door schedules, it's pretty tricky. So you really want to make sure that that is a scenario you may be in, you're addressing it in this plan. Another place where I thought I might have been conflicting with information elsewhere, thinking about what items we're going to exclude in the model. This is, like I said, where it gets back to really talking with people you're working with to make sure you're addressing what they're doing. As you can see, I have a lot of combine or remove. And this was that analysis that I showed, the bad one, where it was too vague. So really putting in project-specific info. And then at the end, we had this detail and modeling plan. And I'm pretty sure this came from someone joined our firm, and they brought their BIM execution plan with them, and this was leftover language. And I probably read through it once when I put it in here, but I don't think I ever came back to it. So I really just said, just to eliminate all of this, this is things that we are addressing at other points in it, and at this point in the game, it was unnecessary. And then definitions at the end. Anytime I've ever included definitions, they get outdated, they don't get updated. I didn't think it was necessary in this particular document, so I removed that as well. So that's kind of an example of where I started and kind of how I went through and really thought about what worked, what didn't work, and really trying to develop a better plan so that we could really incorporate it with the whole project. So any questions again? Great. Well, thank you all for having me up here. I appreciate it. If you do have any questions, reach out to CAD Microsystems. They have all my contact information. I'm obviously always happy to talk about it. That's why I'm here. So thank you all again, and maybe I'll see you sometime soon.
Thank you, Laura, for coming up here. And that's real education on kind of, and I suppose most of you don't use BIM execution plan or project execution plans, but the communication that she was talking about obviously is very valuable on projects so that people aren't wasting time. Hopefully you learn that here, and Laura's sharing that information with you. So thanks for coming out tonight to Revit RVA. We'll see you again in 2 months. Right.